Cast your mind back, not to a motor show, not to a racing circuit, just to an ordinary street, somewhere in Britain, sometime in the mid-1960s. There are kids playing on the pavement. Someone is washing their car on a Sunday morning, and parked outside nearly every other house or so, it seemed, is the same car. Boxy in a friendly sort of way, sitting low on its suspension, in whatever color the dealer had in stock that week. You know this car. You might not be able to name it immediately, but the moment you see one, you will know it in your bones. It is the BMC 1100, or the 1300, or the Morris, or the Austin, or the MG, or the Riley, or the Wolseley, because this single car wore more different names than almost any other in British history. And between 1963 and 1971, it was the best-selling car in Britain, not occasionally, not in one lucky year. Consistently, stubbornly, year after year, it outsold everything else on British roads. Think about that for a moment. Not the Mini, which the whole world was going mad about. Not the Ford Cortina, which Ford was pushing very hard indeed. This one. The car that your mum called the family car and your dad called reliable, and that you probably never gave a second thought to until it was gone. And gone, it very nearly is. Of those 2,100,000 examples built, almost nothing survives on the road today. The reason for that is a story in itself, and we will get to it. But first, Britain in 1962. Harold Macmillan in Downing Street, the Beatles just releasing their first record, the motorways beginning to spread across the landscape, and ordinary working families daring, for the first time, to think about buying a proper motor car, not a van, not a motorcycle, with a sidecar bolted on a real, four-door family saloon, something they could be proud of, outside the front door. BMC had exactly the right car waiting for them. This is its story, and it deserves to be told properly. Section 1. The man behind the machine. To understand the BMC 1100, you have to start with the man who designed it, Alec Issigonis. By 1962, Issigonis was already a legend within BMC. His Mini, launched in 1959, had reinvented the small car from the ground up. Front-wheel drive, a transversely mounted engine, rubber cone suspension, the Mini had compressed extraordinary engineering ingenuity into a tiny package. The motoring world was still catching its breath. But Issigonis was already thinking beyond the Mini. The next project, known inside BMC as AD016, the 16th design produced by the Amalgamated Drawing Office, would take the principles of the Mini and apply them to a larger, more practical family car. The engine would go in sideways, driving the front wheels, just as in the Mini. There would be maximum interior space within compact exterior dimensions. And the whole thing would ride with a quality of comfort that no British family car of that size had yet achieved. What made the 1100 genuinely remarkable, and what set it apart visually from anything else on British roads at the time, was its body design. Issigonis was not a stylist. He was an engineer of the first order, and for the exterior he turned to an Italian. The body of the 1100 was styled by Pininfarina, the Turin design house responsible for some of the most beautiful cars in the world. That flowing, rounded shape, with its elegant proportions and surprisingly generous glass area, came from the same drawing boards as a number of Ferrari Grand Tourers. Not a bad pedigree for a family saloon sold through Morris dealers in Wolverhampton and Walsall. The Morris 1100 made its public debut at the Earl's Court Motor Show in October 1962, and the reception was immediate and enthusiastic. British motoring journalists of the day were genuinely impressed. Here was a car that felt larger inside than its exterior dimensions suggested, that rode with uncommon smoothness, and that handled with a precision that larger, heavier saloons simply could not match. The front-wheel drive layout, combined with the low-slung weight of the transverse engine ahead of the front axle, gave it a balance and a composure that rear-wheel drive rivals of the same period could not approach. It looked modern, it rode beautifully, it was practical, with a proper boot and a rear seat wide enough for 3 adults in reasonable comfort. And it came from a British manufacturer with a vast dealer network that could service it from Land's End to John O'Groats. What else? could a sensible British family want? Section 2. The Hydroelastic Revolution. Now here is where things get genuinely interesting, and where the engineering of the 1100 deserves to be properly recognized. Because most people who drove this car never fully understood what was happening beneath them. The suspension system fitted to the BMC 1100 was called hydroelastic, and it was the work of a brilliant and rather underappreciated engineer named Dr. Alex Moulton. Moulton had already developed the rubber cone suspension used in the Mini, but with hydroelastic, he went considerably further. The idea was elegant in both conception and execution. Each wheel was connected to a fluid-filled displacer unit, essentially a chamber containing a mixture of water and alcohol, with a rubber diaphragm and a spring element. The critical innovation was this: the front and rear displacer units on each side of the car were connected to each other by a pipe. When the front wheel hit a bump and compressed its displacer unit, the fluid was pushed rearward through that interconnecting pipe into the rear unit, which then expanded and raised the rear of the car slightly. The effect was to counteract pitch, that nose-down, tail-up movement that makes a car feel like a seesaw over rough roads. In practice, the hydroelastic system gave the 1100 a ride quality that startled everyone who tried it. British roads in the early 1960s were not the smooth motorway surfaces we take for granted today. They were patchwork affairs full of repairs, crown camber, and the accumulated punishment of decades. The 1100 floated across surfaces that left rival cars shuddering, and it did so while maintaining a level body attitude that was genuinely unusual for a car of its price. There was, however, a weakness, and any owner of one of these cars will tell you about it without much prompting. The hydroelastic system could and did lose pressure over time. A sagging, low-slung 1100 with one corner sitting lower than the rest was a common sight in the late 1960s and 1970s, and it required the attentions of a specialized pump to restore the correct ride height. At an authorized BMC dealer, this was a straightforward service item. In a backstreet garage without the correct equipment, it was another matter entirely. Section 3. A car of many names. One of the defining characteristics of British Leyland and of BMC before it was badge engineering, and the 1100 and 1300 series represents perhaps the most thorough example of that practice in British motoring history. The Morris 1100 arrived in October 1962. Within months, the same car was wearing different badges and different trim levels and selling through entirely separate dealer networks. Let us go through them, because this matters to anyone trying to trace the history of an individual example. The Austin 1100 arrived in 1963, virtually identical mechanically, but with its own distinctive grille and Austin badging. Then came the MG 1100, a version that deserves particular attention because it came with twin SU carburetors on the A-Series 1098 cubic centimeter engine, lifting the power output to approximately 55 brake horsepower, a useful improvement over the standard car's approximately 48 brake horsepower. It also wore MG badges and a slightly sportier interior, and it attracted buyers who wanted something with a little more character. At the more upmarket end of the range, BMC produced the Riley Kestrel and the Wolseley 1100, both of which offered walnut veneer dashboards, leather or leather-faced upholstery, and twin carburetor engines in the manner of the MG. These were genuinely pleasant cars, small enough to be easy in traffic, yet refined enough to suggest a certain position in life. And then there was the extraordinary Vanden Plas Princess 1100, introduced in 1963. Vanden Plas was BMC's coach-building arm, based at Kingsbury in North London, and their version of the 1100 was something quite remarkable. It received a hand-finished interior with genuine walnut, Connolly leather, deep pile carpeting, and individual rear picnic tables, all of this in a car no bigger than a Morris 1100. The contrast between the modest exterior dimensions and the genuinely luxurious interior was something Vanden Plas customers relished deeply. It was, in a real sense, a limousine that could park anywhere. Original prices for the Vanden Plas version were considerably higher than the standard Morris, pushing toward and above £1,000 at a time when the basic car was available for well under $700. The estate version, known variously as the Traveller or Countryman depending on the badge, extended the range's practicality further, making it a genuine all-purpose family vehicle. Section 4. Under the bonnet. Let us talk specifications, because the audience watching this will know these figures and will notice if anything is wrong. The original 1100 used BMC's A-series engine in 1098 cubic centimeter form. This engine was already well proven in the Mini and various other BMC products, and in its standard single carburetor form it produced approximately 48 brake horsepower. In the twin carburetor form fitted to the MG, Riley, and Wolseley variants, output was approximately 55 brake horsepower. These are not large numbers by any standard, but in a car weighing approximately 1,750 pounds in saloon form, they provided perfectly adequate performance for the roads and conditions of the period. Top speed for the standard 1100 was in the region of 80 miles per hour, a figure verified by several period road tests conducted by Autocar and Motor during 1962 and 1963. The MG version, with its extra power and slightly more sporting character, could approach 85 miles per hour. Neither was a quick car by absolute standards, but both were entirely competent by the expectations of the time. In 1967, BMC introduced the 1300, using the 1275 cubic centimeter version of the A-series engine, the same unit that had already proved itself in the Cooper S version of the Mini. In standard form, this engine produced approximately 58 to 60 brake horsepower, providing a worthwhile improvement in performance and, importantly, a more relaxed cruising character that suited the increasing number of motorway miles being covered by British family motorists in the late 1960s. The performance flagship of the entire range was the 1300 GT, introduced in 1969. This came with the 1275 engine fitted with twin SU carburetors, producing approximately 70 brake horsepower, and it offered a genuine turn of pace that surprised drivers expecting a modest family car. It was quick enough, properly driven, to embarrass more expensive machinery on a winding B road. Section 5. Britain's bestseller. Now the numbers. And these numbers matter, because they tell the story of just how completely this car dominated the British market during its prime years. From 1963 onward, the combined ADO 16 range all the Austins, Morrises, MGs, Rileys, Wolseleys, and Vanden Plas models counted together was Britain's best-selling car for most years of the decade. The Ford Cortina, launched in 1962, was a formidable rival, and in certain years it did challenge and occasionally overtake the BMC range. But for the greater part of the period between 1963 and 1971, if you stood on a British high street and counted cars, more of them would be some variant of the 1100 than anything else. Total production across the entire 12-year life of the range, from the Morris 1100's launch in 1962 to the final cars produced in 1974, amounted to more than 2,100,000 examples built across all variants. That is a production figure that stands comparison with the most successful British cars ever made. To put the original prices in context, the Morris 1100 launched in 1962 at a price of approximately £695. A British industrial worker, in 1962, was earning somewhere in the region of £12 to £14 per week, which means the 1100 cost the equivalent of roughly a year's wages, a serious commitment, but one that hundreds of thousands of families decided was worth making. The MG version was priced somewhat higher, and the Vanden Plas Princess, with its London-finished interior, sat well above £1,000, which was a genuinely premium price for a car of those dimensions. What the 1100 offered for that money was, by contemporary standards, exceptional value, more interior space than many larger and more expensive cars. A ride quality that the motoring press consistently praised. Front-wheel drive that made it surprisingly capable in poor weather conditions at a time when most British cars were struggling through winter on narrow cross-ply tires. And the reassurance of a BMC service network that was, at that time, one of the most extensive in the country. Section 6. the problems that sealed its fate. If the 1100 and 1300 had a fatal flaw, and it did, and it was a serious one, it was rust. These cars corrode. They corrode comprehensively, structurally, and in ways that make restoration either extremely expensive or simply impossible. The floor pans go, the sills go. The front and rear subframes, which are structural components carrying the suspension and the engine, rot through. The inner wings dissolve. If you stood a neglected example on soft ground in a wet British winter, you could watch it sink. The steel used in British cars of this era was not always of the highest quality, and the rust-proofing applied during manufacture was minimal by any modern standard. BMC was not alone in this. Ford, Vauxhall, and Roots all produced cars from this period with similar longevity problems, but the 1100 seems to have been particularly susceptible, possibly because of its monocoque construction and the way water could collect in the box sections of the bodywork. This is the single most important reason why so few of these cars survive today. More than 2 million were built. The number currently registered and roadworthy in the United Kingdom is a tiny fraction of that total, a few thousand at most, the majority of which are maintained by dedicated enthusiasts who treat rust prevention as a continuous occupation rather than an occasional chore. That contrast between the extraordinary production numbers and the near absence of survivors tells you everything about how corrosion consumed this generation of British cars. Beyond rust, there were other issues that period owners will remember. The hydroelastic suspension, as noted, required specialist equipment to maintain at the correct pressure. The A-series engine, for all its durability and tunability, had a known tendency toward head gasket failure, particularly if the cooling system was neglected or if the car was driven hard when cold. And the gearbox, shared with the Mini, was satisfactory, but not especially refined. The synchromesh on first gear was absent on early examples, which required some patience in city traffic. None of these problems were unusual for a car of its era and price. They were, by the standards of the early 1960s, entirely normal. But they compounded over the years, and combined with the rust, they consigned enormous numbers of 1100s and 1300s to the scrapyard long before their time. So, what do we make of this forgotten giant? The BMC 1100 and 1300 series was, in every measurable commercial sense, one of the most successful British cars ever produced. It was Britain's best-selling car for the better part of a decade. It was genuinely engineered by some of the finest minds in the British motor industry, Alec Isagonis, Alex Moulton, and the stylists at Pininfarina. It offered a combination of interior space, ride quality, and front-wheel drive capability that no direct rival could match at the price. And it carried millions of British families, your families, perhaps through the 1960s and into the 70s. And yet, it is almost entirely absent from the classic car scene today. You will not find it filling the concours fields at major shows. You will not find it dominating the pages of the specialist magazines. The cars that survive are cared for by a small and passionate community, and they deserve far more recognition than the general public, or indeed the classic car world typically gives them. Part of the reason for that absence is simply rust. The cars are gone. But part of it, perhaps, is that the 1100 was too normal, too ubiquitous in its day, too associated with the ordinary rhythms of working British life, to attract the nostalgic glamour that clings to the E-Type or the Aston, or the big American muscle cars of the same era. It was not a car that announced itself, it was a car that got on with the job. Which is, when you think about it, exactly what Britain needed in 1962. Now I would genuinely love to hear from you. Did your family own one of these? A Morris? An Austin? An MG? A Wolseley? Do you remember the way the hydroelastic suspension smoothed out the roads? Do you remember the smell of the interior on a summer morning? Leave your stories in the comments below. This is exactly the kind of history that deserves to be kept alive by the people who actually lived it. If you found this video worthwhile, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel. It genuinely helps this content reach the people who care about it. And thank you, sincerely, for watching. You are the audience that makes this worth doing properly.